And
Okay.
yeah, we have a few people already. Welcome, welcome. Oh. Uh, so okay, so I'll just start with my instructions to everybody. If you want to look at the chat, I've put some notes there just to remind people to have their microphone turned off during the session, and also that the session is being recorded. There will be some time for questions, as well as some questions after even we finish recording. We'll have a moment to talk more freely. We do have another conversation coming up this Saturday I wanted to make you aware of, with the artist Amado Alfadni, and also the Poetathon, which is a special 24-hour poetry day from sunset Budapest time to sunset the next day. And you can find all the information about that on the Cloud Conversations website. So my name is Anne Murray. I'm the curator of Cloud Conversations, and we're here today with Greg Baines, and he's outside of Canberra in Australia, and he's going to talk to us about his process in his novel that has recently been published by Fairlight Books, and it's available online. You can check with him that information. I put his Facebook writers page here. You can go directly to the link, and you can save the chat now if you would like. It's so that you don't forget this information. In the chat window, there's small 3 dots, and you can opt to save now. So if you want to save that information. So Greg, let's go ahead and get started. I think that more people will enter as we go, so hopefully they can catch up. All right, great, thanks. I'm going to mute my microphone now.
Okay, no worries. All right. So I hope you can, and if you can give me a thumbs up that you can hear me. Okay. Yeah. Cool. Okay. So this is my second novel, or this is actually, The Nail House is actually a novella that I started when I was living in Shanghai, and I only really finished editing and polishing it up when I came back to Australia. But originally it was much longer work. The first novel I'd written about and wrote when I was in China was called Disco Mao, and it was very much a white guy talking about his experiences in China, and it was a fiction, but it was kind of a meld of a few different people I worked with. Our stories of coming upon China for the first time. It was really grounded in the early 2000s, and I think China was a very different place then. With this one, The Nail House, I started writing it first, sort of much later. So I think around 2007, 2008, I'd known a lot more about China, a lot more had happened to me in that time. And I kind of interact with people at home when I came back to visit Australia. And I was kind of a little bit stunned sometimes and shocked sometimes with the way that China was thought about and represented in the media back here, and how sort of dehumanized Chinese people were and China was. So when I wrote The Nail House, I wanted it to be a more deeply personal story, and I wanted to try and treat China and the people as people. And so I kind of went on a limb because I wanted to get really deep inside the story, and it's a romance. And originally it had several main characters, one being, and he was going to fall in love with a local Chinese girl. And when I started writing it, I would workshop the early drafts with writing friends in Shanghai. And I started experimenting with some first person writing from the girl's point of view. And I didn't know if I could pull it off. So I was at that stage trying to write from a first person expat point of view and then dip into her as first person. I wasn't sure if I was going to pull it off. And the writing group was mainly foreigners, but a couple of Chinese people as well. And I kind of workshopped what they thought of the idea, and it worked really, really well. So the novel ended up, I stripped out lots of stuff, and the final version of the novel, which was published last year, is um, first person, one chapter him, one chapter her. So it goes from white point of view to local Chinese woman point of view. And that worked really, really well. And in the end, I found it actually easier to write from the Chinese female perspective, which really surprised me. And I found it really difficult to do the white guy perspective. And I still am not sure exactly why. But it was kind of interesting. One of the doubts I had about writing in that way in the beginning was I thought, what right does a white Anglo-Saxon have to write from the point of view of a Chinese person? And I kind of agonized over that. My wife is Malaysian Chinese, and she said I'd done a reasonable job, and I did have feedback. But in the end, what persuaded me to push on with the project was I think that there is a value in expats or outsiders telling the story of someone from another culture, because if they can pull it off well, and I hope that I do, I guess the reader has to judge for that. If you pull it off well, you can articulate that culture in a way that is sometimes better received and more well understood by your native culture. So I think the way I frame it enables it to be sort of a little bit more accessible to people in the West or in Australia in particular. So I think there is a value in that. I did have some sleepless nights worrying that I wasted my time, but I think it does have a real value to it. So that was a really, really interesting process. And it was the first time I'd written anything substantial where I was once a month for a year, or once every month to 6 weeks, actually workshopping bits I'd written with a group of people and taking that feedback and making changes. So that was quite an interesting process. It wasn't as solitary as the regular writing of a novel. So I think that was really, really good. I also based the book very loosely around Swinzer, who wrote The Art of War, the very famous text. And that's studied still by many people for business and for military strategy and all sorts of stuff. But it kind of occurred to me that love itself can be a confrontation and can be like a guerrilla war. And the working title of the book was Unrestricted Guerrilla Warfare, which is something that Mao developed that comes from Swinzer. And I thought sometimes love and relationships are a little bit like that. So I thought that was quite appropriate. And the book has quotes from Swinzer quite regularly through the book as well. I was really influenced primarily too by lots of really good Chinese writers that we can access now in English. And one is a lady called Shan Sa, who wrote a wonderful book called The Girl Who Played Go. And that is controversially told from the point of view of a Japanese man and a Chinese woman, chapter for chapter, much the same way I have done mine. And she greatly influenced me. She pulled it off to, a Chinese woman from Nanjing, I think, originally, going back to World War II and pulling off this really amazing perspective, Japanese perspective, which I thought was extraordinary. And that kind of gave me the confidence to try and pull it off as well. So I guess if there are any questions at this stage, it'd be interesting to hear. And then I wanted to sort of talk about my take on China, because I think, I hope that the way I've approached China and problems in China is different to some other texts. So if there are any questions at this stage, that would be really good.
Great. I think I'll start with the questions because I'm curious. Your background, I know that you taught in China for many years. That's how we know each other. And I'm just curious if you felt that your experience there as a teacher actually had a specific kind of influence in how you write or how you approached it. Because I think that it's very, it seems very logical, your process, and very informed as far as how you workshopped it and how you considered your approach. And so I'm just wondering how that developed, how that kind of approach developed. If you have some thoughts about that, if you feel that being a teacher influenced a bit your way of perceiving things, or I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, I think, I guess being a teacher, you're working in a collaborative environment. So literally, I think that did help. And you're right, I was there for 13 years in the end. Um, I think being a teacher, and I taught lots of Chinese students, I taught at international schools, but I think sort of half my time there was spending time with lots of Chinese students, either from the diaspora, Hong Kong, Taiwan, but also mainland China, and working with lots of Chinese colleagues too. And then I know we worked at a school where we were surrounded by Chinese colleagues. I think that helped because I was immersed in the culture and I was connected to it. And I think too, with getting feedback from drafts, I felt a responsibility to make sure I got it right. Um, because it would be so easy to get it wrong. I mean, I think if I was writing about Australia, and I'm writing something at the moment that's about sort of Australia, and I feel the same sense of responsibility about kind of getting it wrong. But I think as an Australian, you can sort of say, well, that's my view of Australia. But I think being an outsider, I felt nervous about not wanting to kind of get it really, really wrong. So I think being a teacher and being immersed in that world and interacting with locals all the time, even in kind of incidental conversations, it gave me a sense to get ideas on body language and the way people approached conversation, and all that kind of thing too. So I think that helped immensely.
Wow, so I'm gonna that's great. It's very interesting, and I'm gonna open it up for questions. There's a few people I know here already. I wonder if they might have some questions. Marina, she is a director of a residency in Assisi, Arte Studio Ginestrelle in Italy, and also Dalia, who is an artist working with video work in Algeria, in Algiers. So I wonder if either of you, perhaps you have a question for us or anyone else. It would be really great to hear from you.
Oh, while we're waiting too, just because Dahlia is involved with film, I just wanted to kind of say too, when I wrote the first Nail House, much more so than Disco Mount, but this current one, I was thinking film too. So for me as a writer, I want to write the kind of books that if I close my eyes at the end of the chapter, I see it as a film, and I very much write as film. So I write it, and I write it. The book's written in very short chapters too. I'm not sure how short the shortest chapter was from memory, but I think it sort of averages from 3 to sort of 10 pages max. So I write in really short, sharp. So yeah, it's interesting that film is kind of the way I see things as I write as well.
Okay, I think people are a little bit shy to ask some questions. I think that's really curious. It's interesting that the film came up also because I mentioned that, and I'm wondering from one novel to the next. The first one that you self-published, and now this one has that connection to film been continual. Did you have that idea, or have you come to realize that about your writing after the fact? I'm just curious about whether that was in both.
I think Disco Mao is more interior. It's more sort of like a traditional novel. So I wasn't thinking as filmically, but I think, I mean, my dream, I guess lots of writers' dream is to have someone pick it up as a film or use it as the basis for a film. So I think that was part of it. I'm sort of being pragmatic as well, but I think the pace of film, I think, is really good. Like I like to write short, fairly exciting work that races you through. One of the first readers of the novel fed back to me that they read it in a day. Like they sat down and it kind of was like a film. They had to get through it. And I really enjoy that too. I found as an artist that it meant that I was less fatigued with writing it because I can really get it out. I have these wonderful sharp scenes, and even if there's not much physical movement in a chapter, I'll have a set or like a photograph of something in my head that the whole chapter's pinned around. So there's one chapter where the Chinese girl is marrying. I don't want to give too much plot away, but she's actually engaged to a local guy at the beginning of the novel, and she's doing her wedding photography, and they're kind of rushing, so they're having their wedding photos done in the snow, which is very unusual, and she's kind of slipping and sliding around the snow, arguing with her fiance in this white wedding dress. So that was kind of this one almost photograph that I had in my head. That chapter revolves around, and then that's it. Then you move on. So I found it really fun for me as a writer, and it helps keep me through it, because I think I'm writing also something now that's really long. It's about 388 pages, and it's a bit less filmic, and it's harder to write. So I really enjoy writing that way. It's much better.
Do you think that this is a contemporary kind of a relationship, as far as this relationship to film, because we're familiar with kind of this episodic, or this these snapshot kind of perspective of things, and so there's been a transition in novel writing and in the approach, not just with your own work, but with other writers, or are there some other writers that you might have been inspired by, or like, or interested in because of this?
Hmm. I read, these days I read a lot of Chinese fiction, obviously translated into English. My Chinese is not that good. And there, most of that contemporary writing to me, particularly mainland Chinese writing, kind of romps through like film as well. I also think writing like that, for me personally, is influenced by the internet too, because I've realized as an artist, you have to capture people's attention and keep it. And we've all got less time. And I think writing like that also creates a more compelling piece of work. Um, Although you do notice in fiction now this trend towards these huge tomes. So some writers gone the other way and said, sometimes we need release from that, and they write these enormous tomes of books, which is wonderful too. I've finished a Murakami, was the last non-Chinese book I wrote that was read, that was 600 pages long. So I think that's sometimes an antidote to that. But I think for me as an artist, I prefer something that has a lot of punch to it. So for me, film's a wonderful template. And often if I'm stuck for an idea, or if I'm trying to figure out the arc of the story, I'll watch a film, and that kind of helps me get it straight in my head.
Oh, that's really curious. That idea that you kind of watch a film and that kind of brings, it kind of suddenly makes me think about like somebody like Tarkovsky, or are there particular films or that stick in your mind as kind of been that were inspiring or influential, or you can kind of relate to with your work?
None in particular. I just like the compressed nature of film, because it's doing a lot of what a novel's doing, but it's much more economical because it's using a quick visual language. No, nothing in particular stands out. But there are some great Chinese films. Funny, I can't remember the names of them offhand, but sort of these realist social dramas that come out of China are really good too. And they're kind of slow, but there's a lot of visually dramatic stuff happening that kind of sees underneath the surface. I find them quite inspiring as well.
Yeah, I find that I'm not that aware of what's going on with contemporary Chinese films. You're kind of making me think I should watch some more and read some more. So that's really great. I'm also wondering about your own art practice, because you are a painter,
Mm, yeah.
and I think that you have a very unique style and also sense of color in your work. And I'm wondering how you might interpret the connection between what you do visually in your painting and how you write, if there's anything that you see as a connection, or comments that you've heard from people in the past about that.
Yeah, actually, that's a great question, because when people ask me sort of the nuts and bolts of how you write, like how you edit and all that kind of stuff, I actually just say it's like painting an oil painting. So I actually use exactly the same process pretty much, where I kind of do very abstract work, and it's usually really quick, like quick explosions of activity. And then I might get stuck and leave it, and then some more quick explosions of activity. And starting off in oil painting, I tend to do acrylic nowadays, but starting off as an oil painter, for me, it was all about layers and scratching stuff off and putting stuff on. And I actually write in exactly the same way. So I might write a really quick, like 3 chapters, and they might be rubbish. And then I go through and I rewrite and I rewrite again and I rewrite again and I delete, rewrite, and may even trash one of the chapters. But I just have to keep writing. So I'm not one of those writers who writes very carefully and agonizes over stuff. I kind of do it like an abstract painting, like I'm splashing stuff around, scratch off what doesn't work, cover over what didn't work. And if something's revealed, keep it. And even if it's revealed for another work, keep it for the other work. But yeah, it's actually almost, in my mind, it's exactly the same process. So it's funny you mentioned that.
I was just wondering about that because I was just thinking about when I was younger, when I was painting, working on an art piece, there would sometimes be a moment that was one of the most frustrating moments when you have a part that you like and somehow that becomes an obstacle. Actually, you're trying to somehow marry everything around it, and in the end I learned about myself that I had to get rid of that part, actually, the part that I thought was the most successful. And then it was like a dam opening up. Then I could actually make the whole work together. Have you ever had that experience with writing?
Absolutely. But I think the good thing about writing is you can, because I have it with painting as well. Like often I'll do this painting and I'm unhappy with it, but the bottom left-hand corner is fantastic. And I think, well, I can't use the bottom left-hand corner. But the beauty of writing is, particularly these days, you can just take it out and put it in another file, and it could form the basis of a short story or something completely different. So yeah, with writing, that's a whole lot easier because you can. And I think I'm more brutal with the writing because you think, you know what, it's okay, I can get rid of that. So yeah, it's okay. I think I find that hard. I agonize over that with painting too. I find that really difficult. But I think writing, the beauty of writing is you are a little bit more liberated to you reuse, I think, which is good. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really curious how that happens, and it's interesting what you say. So it's about also the medium. The medium of writing is more flexible, actually, which is interesting because you have words that are our limitation, but and with painting you have kind of this limitless field because you can create your own semiotics. But at the same time, it takes time for the oil paint to dry. It's layering. It's also got its limitations, like a language, and because of the medium. So I'm just wondering also if there's something else about the nature of how you work that you'd like to share with us. We have about 5 minutes left, and then I'll turn the recording off. And so maybe some of the shyer people, if they don't feel confident to be recorded, can ask some more questions. So I'll turn it over to you again if there's something else about your work you'd like to share with us, or comments that you've heard, or something about your travels that may have influenced your work.
Yeah, sure. I just wanted to say that, which was the kind of the second bit, was that one of the reasons I wrote the book was when I used to come home or see news from Western media about China, it was very political. So it was often framed China in a particular way. And my experience and the experience of the people I knew in China was that for Chinese people, the struggles are not the struggles that we think they are in the West. So we're presented with this notion that Chinese people are struggling for their freedom, and civil liberties are a big issue, et cetera, et cetera. But, for most Chinese people and most middle-class educated Chinese people, that is entirely not the case. And lots of the pain and the struggle for Chinese people at the moment is with capitalism, so neoliberalism, being not paid by private companies, having their apartments raised by private companies, who've been perhaps bought off a local governor, but it's actually not the government's problem, it's the private company's problem. Dealing with the fact that their parents had these wonderful pensions and deals with the government that they no longer have in private enterprise, struggling for sick pay and kind of negotiating with private enterprise. So for me, one of the really interesting things I learned was their needs and their concerns are very, very different from the ones that we kind of project on them from abroad. And when I see this stuff about China at the moment in the media, um, it's really most Western people's understanding of China and what the Chinese people want and what they struggle with is at odds with the reality. And I tried to bring some of that out in the novel, and the novel set around a private company and, with private thugs. And I tried to kind of bring that out a little bit too, because I think the nature on the ground of the country is very, very different. The Chinese government's actually very popular with most people, particularly at the moment. A lot like any country, there is a diversity of opinion too, but I think the kind of concerns that they have are very, very different. And I think, and I hope that people use fiction, because if you pick up novels and there are many really good ones translated into English, written by mainland writers, you do see some of these concerns. And you compare that to some of the stuff you see in the tabloid press, and it's like we're talking about two completely different countries. I went to China in the holidays just before the pandemic and asked some friends about some issues that had come up in Western media, and they just laughed. It's like, why would we be worried about that? And that's actually fantastic. So it's quite intriguing, and I hope that my work and other people's work, particularly mainland stuff translated in English, I hope that sort of enlightens people about what the real concerns are for Chinese people.
That is such an important thing to bring up. It's really great that you're considering that and sharing that, because I also have found that, in traveling and spending a lot of time in North Africa, the reaction, because I am American and Irish, so the reaction from my American friends is really a lot of fear about North Africa, because it's something they never hear about, they don't know about. And I think that they think it must be dangerous somehow. It's a very strange perception, and about what Africa seen as a continent country instead of a place where there's a bunch of individual countries, because people know very little about it, and the projected perceptions of what it is to live in a place, and what your fears or what your freedoms and limitations, how those things feel. It's very hard for them to understand, or for any of us to understand, until we've gone outside of our own community and gone and lived and spoken to and experienced it ourselves. A lot of times it's very, very hard to understand what the day-to-day constrictions or confinements might be. And this is something I hope, and I know that you have, and myself as well, have really worked towards in being educators, to share and to help people to postulate and consider and question their own perceptions and own projected mores and ethics. And so that's really wonderful that you bring that up. So now, if we have any other questions that people could ask, I'm going to turn the recording off now. And so hopefully maybe people will feel a little more confident. I just want to say thank you very much to you, Greg, for being here and for sharing your thought process and the development of your novel, The Nail House, as well as the background that you have that enriches that and the research that you've done. And I also want to remind people again, we have many other things that are going on with Cloud Conversations. So I hope that you will come on Saturday and meet artist Amado Alfadni, and also come to the Poetathon, which is our 24-hour poetry sessions. You can find all of the links on the website. And thank you very much for the people who have come, and I really, really, really appreciate your support and interest.